So, our first speaker tonight is Professor Alex Sanmark, Professor of Medieval Archaeology at the University of Highlands and Islands, and also Associate Professor of Archaeology at Uppsala University in Sweden. She studied at the University of London all the way through to PhD level, where she obtained a PhD from UCL on the subject of the Christianization of Scandinavia. Since then, she's worked at universities in Sweden, in England, and now in Scotland. There's a broad range of research interests, topics and locations, reaching as far afield as Vanuatu, rather fabulously. Her key research interest, so far as I can glean from her academic profile page, is in Iron Age Scandinavia, and especially the Viking Age and the westerly expansion of the Vikings, and hence have interest in the British Isles. She worked on a number of fantastic sounding research projects, including the Assembly Project, or TAP for short, looking at assembly sites across Northern Europe between the 5th and the 15th centuries, which led, her particular strand led to the book Viking Law and Order, which is a great read for medieval archaeologists as well as those interested in police procedural dramas on TV. Less that today. She's done much other interesting work. I happened to grab off my bookshelf her latest volume of hers. I think probably the first thing that I encountered Professor Sanmark's work. It's probably it's so long ago that I can't believe he's brought that up. She's laughing, so I take that as a good sign. And sort of bring us right up to date in 2020, or in the collection Anglo-Saxon Studies in Archaeology and History, volume 22, year 2020. She published an article looking at the early medieval assembly sites at Runnymede, Kingston and Thames, at Westminster, and that is a subject, this starting point on which she will talk to us tonight. So without further ado, please take it away, Professor Sanmark.
Thank you for inviting me today to come and speak to you. It's good fun. This is a subject that I like very much, and it's actually kind of an offshoot actually of the assembly project and the work that I did for that. I worked so much on, I started off with sort of Scandinavian assembly sites, thing sites, and then looking, of course, at the expansion into the North Atlantic, Scotland, Ireland, England to some extent, and then also looked at royal inauguration sites. And then the more I was looking at the Thames Valley and Westminster in particular, and discussing with colleagues, I started thinking that, the pattern that I can see in Scandinavia, I can sort of see it here in England too. And there were then these three sites then, Kingston and Thames and Westminster and Runnymede, that caught my attention. And that led to the article. I think that maybe Rob spotted and invited me to come and talk to you today. So in this paper, then I will first of all tell you a little bit about the background to my research on England, and what the general picture that I arrived at, the nature of assembly sites, what features that they tend to have, and particularly in thinking about their location in the landscape. So this, what I'm talking about today, is a lot to do with landscape features and landscape characteristics, and also thinking about how assembly sites, inauguration sites are used as for rituals, so that they are in a way designed for rituals that should be seen and viewed by as many people as possible, so that the events there are then sort of approved and get known across and accepted across the kingdom. So I would say that the royal rituals we can trace at these sites are very much part of a process of legitimization for kings. So we've got these 3 sites under examination. You see they're all located then, as we know, in the Thames Valley, and they're of course 3 very well-known sites, sites of great symbolic significance in the Middle Ages. We've got Kingston and Thames as a well-known royal vale and a place of assembly and coronations. Westminster, a location of coronations from the 11th century at least, and then Runnymede, of course, the sealing of the Magna Carta in 1215. So these sites are well known, and there are major events that we know took place at these sites. But what then surprised me, that despite this, very little work had actually been done on the features of these sites and how they came to be selected for all the these noteworthy events in the Middle Ages. This is what I'm going to be talking about, their role as assembly sites, looking at their shared characteristics, and in particular then examine the wider political and the ritual landscape, and looking at the transition really from itinerant kingship to Westminster becoming sort of the permanent seat of power and administration. But before we get to that, I want to look at Scandinavia. So this is the kind of backdrop from my study. So what you're seeing here is obviously a map of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And the districts are all legal districts, administered districts. Most of these had 1 law each. And each district also had its own major assembly site. And one of the interesting patterns that I came across when I was doing my research was that this pattern, that it's a medieval pattern. In Sweden, we can, sticking with Sweden for now, or we can do all of Scandinavia really, at least from the 12th, 13th centuries, we know that these districts were in place, but there's a lot to suggest that in some form they're probably earlier as well. So this is a very old organization, and despite that, it has had a great influence on modern geography today. So there are many sites then, assembly sites that have their roots in the early Iron Age, around sort of like the 1st century AD, sometimes further back in time, and they have been in use throughout the Iron Age into the Scandinavian Middle Ages, and then their location is still influencing how politics are and administration is run today. So I find that that's an interesting pattern, and of course this links into my talk about Westminster, etc. So we're going to look at a site, Linköping, which is located here, number 19, because this is quite an interesting. I need to point on this screen here. You can see that's the one. I think hope you can see that. This is an interesting example. So this town then, Linköping, in the province of Östergötland in Sweden, is quite a major town or city in Sweden today, and this is interesting because this is one example of we have an Iron Age, or a site with roots in the Iron Age that became a really important medieval assembly site. You can see the location in this black circle here. This is an area with a number of burials, ship settings, a huge collection of archaeological remains, particularly from the Iron Age right here. It's also location of a really important routeway that crossed across and the river here and carried on, and this is part of a royal ritual route that kings travelled across their kingdom. There was a crossing point here, and just across the river the medieval town grew up. And we have this kind of pattern with a major assembly site with roots in the Iron Age, and then a medieval town, often as an important town, and a lot of the time, you know, they are bishoprics as well. We have that pattern, and sometimes the medieval town is so close to the old assembly site that the old assembly site just remains in use, even though it's actually not really located within the medieval town. The other pattern tends to be that the medieval town grows up maximum about 10 kilometers from one of these early assembly sites, and because the distance is too far, or because in this part of Sweden there's a lot of changing of shorelines, many old water routes became unusable at this point in time. So these old assembly sites a lot of time became difficult to travel to, and there was a shift then from the old assembly sites into towns. But on the whole then, this striking pattern of assembly site with Iron Age remains located maximum 10 kilometer from an important town, a lot of the time a bishopric. And this is the pattern that I was, you know, also been sort of noticing in England, and this is why I call sort of, we have a gradual concentration of power. So I call these sort of areas of power that we can sort of focus in on when we study, you know, past power relations. So in terms of assembly sites, they're interesting, and they're sometimes a bit difficult to explain to people, because a lot of time we're dealing with long continuities in time. Sites tend to remain in use for a long period of time, but it's not static. A lot of changes are taking place, and sometimes old assembly sites are also abandoned in favor of new ones. It all depends on the sort of choice that the elite were making. Because I do see the elite, the assembly sites as an expression of elite power. It's the way that the elite could exercise their power. They were, of course, reliant on the wider population to come to these sites and you know, approve of political decisions, or approve inaugurations and royal elections, etc. And it was important then for the elite that the assembly sites were important sites that could stood out in the landscape, and they're not sites, and as I said, they're not randomly chosen, but very much the result of an elite strategy, a selection of the site, and also construction and maintenance, and maybe also designing and redesigning the sites. We can see that many of these sites, you know, change a lot over time, although they might remain in use over, say, 1,000 years, but there are different features that are added at different points in time. I think the point here is that these sites should be imposing. When people were, you know, traveling to the assemblies, they should know when they had arrived at the assembly. There should be no question in their minds that they had arrived at the assembly site. This is where the important decisions are made. And I've sort of made the comparison with courts and parliament buildings today. That we also, when we arrive at Parliament, we know that there's no question that they were at the right place. so that I think in the interest of the elite then was to make sure that these sites kept having the right features, that they were always in the right locations as well. And when needed, then the sites were redesigned and even at times then moved to a new location or a whole new one created. Then we also got assembly rituals, as I mentioned earlier. So as they're quite well designed in a way you can look at them as sort of theatre stages where these rituals were played out so that people could stand around and see what took place. And if we're thinking about oral society, which is of course where these rituals originated, there was no written documentation of what had happened. Everything had to be played out in front of an audience. The audience, they were the witnesses. They were, in the sense, the documentation, and people could go back to them later and say, "Did you see?" Take a simple thing as a legal transaction. If legal transaction was disputed at latest date, could go back to the witnesses and say, "Well, you saw the ritual, you saw." So when you sell land, you sort of hand over a stick from the seller to the buyer, and they could say, "Yes, we saw the stick changing hands. We know that the land changed hands." So these rituals, and this applies also, I think, to inauguration rituals, that they're designed in the sense so that people should be able to see what happened. They might not necessarily hear everything that was being said. I don't think that was the most important thing. It's more like a wedding, what you can see from afar, and you can see where they are. The couple are sort of in part of the whole ritual. And certain assembly features then were designed to really organize the rituals. So there's lots of linear monuments that seem to have functioned as sort of procession routes, for example. And it does seem that the rulers probably made use of the local population. They built the site, and in that sense also had ownership of the site. So this is mainly based on Scandinavian evidence, but we can look at Anglo-Saxon royal rituals too. And we can see that there's a great awareness of rituals among Anglo-Saxon kings too, and that they also understood the significance of place and spectacle in their rituals, and that they used natural or older features to stage public displays. One interesting example is Edgar's coronation. We're told that took place at a great assembly in 973. So that was held then in the Roman Tower of Bath, and we're told that at least 10 other kings were in attendance. And then the ceremony continued in Chester at the monastery of St. John the Baptist, and just by a very impressive amphitheatre. And the kings then travelled to Chester by boat along the River Dee, and we're told that Edgar was at the helm, and the other kings then were at the oars. So this is a really interesting ritual, and Julia Barrows suggested then that this is a ritual that draws on Roman traditions, but also known amongst Carolingians, for example, and that it was designed to signal the consensus between the kings. Perhaps it's easy to think that perhaps it was Edgar's overlordship, but there was consensus, and they all approved of this, and they took part in this ritual together. So we can now then move on and start looking at the sites in question. So I've got this map here, Thames Valley, and we've got this concentration of sites then. I mean, the Thames, of course, is a really important feature. It's been important to humans from the earliest times. And it's not surprising that we see a concentration of power around this important water route. But it's interesting that the area then is particularly popular for holding royal assemblies, and we can see this above all from the 10th century. So at this time, the area north of the Thames was most often favoured, and this was most likely then due to the merging of Wessex and Mercia, and that made this area convenient then for people travelling from the wider area. And as Mercia was no longer considered a threat, and then the Thames, you know, became this kind of it wasn't a boundary anymore; it was more of an area of peace. So it's interesting. We find the 3 sites here, all located on the banks of the Thames, and thinking about, you know, later geography. None of these sites then are found, you know, within Anglo-Saxon London, but, you know, in this wider area, covering about 30 kilometers as the bird flies. So what did an assembly site look like? So I've put together some key features here. And this is drawn on research done by myself and my colleagues in the Assembly Project, but also other colleagues working with England in the early Middle Ages. And it's striking that we tend to find very, very similar features across, you know, all these different areas. It's important then to say that, you know, these different features, I'll go through them in a second. It's not that we find every single of these features at every single assembly site. But it's as if there was a, you know, a number of popular characteristics that were chosen between when assembly sites were created. And this is then to create, you know, this sort of architecture of assembly. So one of the most important features then is that a location on convergence of communication routes, both land and water routes, and often by fords and bridges. And as I said earlier, these, you know, the rituals that were played out here, they should be witnessed by as many people as possible. And of course, therefore, these sites had to be accessible so that, you know, people could actually travel there easily. There should be natural meeting places. And so this really explains why we have this really, really striking location at important communication routes. We can see that many of them located at places we call liminal, meeting point between land and water. A lot of the time we can see evidence of cultic practices, and that can be burial, that can be sort of ritual depositions, and either it's just at the site or in very, very close proximity. I've already mentioned that a lot of the time we have these long biographies of sites, and with, you know, sites that are medieval, but they're used stretching far back into prehistory. The actual meetings are often difficult to find in archaeological terms. You know, what traces can we find of people standing around and talking at a particular place? So that can be difficult. Sometimes there's evidence of hearth material, you know, cooking pits, etc. And I think these are sites that people maybe stayed for a few days and they came together and they cooked and ate together as part of the rituals. But the sites also tend to be very clearly marked out in the landscape. by mounds and other elevated features. I think the point here is that these sites could be seen from afar. So that, again, when people traveled, they knew what to look for, and they knew when they had arrived at the site. Okay, so if we go to the first site looking at tonight, Kingston on Thames. So as I mentioned earlier, then this is a place of coronation for a number of Anglo-Saxon kings in the 10th century. The sources are a little bit vague, and some sources are later than others. So there's a little bit of disagreement on exactly who has been crowned here, but it's clearly from the 10th century. So it's also place of royal assemblies and synods in the 9th and the 10th centuries. And the earliest charter refers to the really significant meeting in 838, when the kingdoms of Kent, Surrey, Sussex, and Essex agreed then to be within the kingdom of the West Saxons. Have a royal Witan here in 972. And other charters also give evidence of land grant, etc., having taken place here in the 10th century. It's also a place of the assembly of the 100, and this meant to be a royal vill, and we know that from written sources. So it seemed to be an estate with a major church where royal assemblies were held. But the archaeological evidence here is very vague. It's not known where these assemblies were held. 100 meetings were a lot of time held outdoors, just like in the Scandinavian sites that I've just shown you. They're all outdoor assemblies. And J.R. Madicott, who studied many of the Witan meetings, he suggested that perhaps they were also held outdoors. And the reason he suggested that, because he was looking at the witness lists and saw that, there's a large number of witnesses, and so there are probably too many there wouldn't have been a building large enough to everybody to witness these assemblies. So he suggested they may have been outdoors, but we don't know exactly where this would have been. There's some written references, interesting, talking about coronation, saying that it took place on a platform erected in the marketplace of the Royal Vale or in the chapel of St. Mary. There is, very little archaeological evidence here. I don't think it's particularly surprising. It's a very built-up area. It's also on the floodplain. So there's been, a lot of changes over time here. But of course, we've got the so-called Coronation Stone, now found at the Guildhall. This is an interesting stone. It's said to have been situated within the chapel of St. Mary, and there are quite a few stones like this in other parts of the world. In Scandinavia, there are several examples of stones that are used as part of inauguration rituals. In Sweden, the inauguration site outside Uppsala is called Mora Stones, and there are many written references about the stones that were used as part of the inauguration rituals. In Denmark, there are excuse me, at least 2 of these stones known as well. And they're all sort of quite, some of them are lost and others are, been preserved. Whether we have actually have the actual stones, were these stones part of the rituals, we have no idea. But they don't look very much. They're not very sort of impressive stones at all. But they do seem to link into a tradition that relates to Germanic kings, and that they should be elevated as part of their inauguration, and that they could, maybe step up or sit down. We're talking about stones or shields or chairs. So, this might not be the stone but it does tell us about what seems to have been quite a common ritual in the Middle Ages. Kingston and Thames, thinking about the site, it has assembly features too. It's located then on the convergence of a number of land routes. There's a fording point. There is a late tradition of a fording point here. It says that Kingston was once named Morford, the marshy ford, so that's quite a good. We do have land routes coming together here. It's also then a central position to the Anglo-Saxon realm as a whole, because we've got the boundaries of kingdoms sort of all intersecting nearby. We'll come back to this when we talk about Runnymede later on. It's also interesting that it's located on a small island. So this island is often referred to as the Central Island. And this was a raised area, had views of the surrounding region, and has said that it could be seen to kind of lay claim to the surrounding areas. And this is a pattern that's been observed at other assemblies in England. And it's also, this is said regarding the Scandinavian assembly sites, that this means that the site can then be seen from afar in the relatively flat landscape. Also, what's really interesting is that this island then was situated in the alluvial marshlands of the Thames at the highest tidal reach of the sea. So this then places this in the kind of a liminal location between the land and the sea. And this is something that Sarah Semple, for example, has looked at before, and argued that places where the waters had significant qualities, for example, intertidal zones, places with seasonal surges, had particular value, as these were places where humans were encountering raw nature and needed to safely interact with these places. Also, this site has a really long evidence of long occupation archaeologically, and there's also some early ritual activity too. So I think altogether these traits then make good sense. So to explain why this became a place of coronation, and to explain why Kingston gave such an important role then in the English kingdom and the development of England. And we'll come back to this later. So let's go on to Westminster and start with so we got Westminster Abbey was consecrated in 1065 and is documented as a place of coronations from 1066, and of course remains so today, and has been the permanent site of Parliament since the 13th century. Westminster then was the site of a number of royal assemblies in the early Middle Ages, and was used for this purpose and then with increasing frequency over time. There are three sort of crown-wearing episodes. These are, major assemblies that were held here in the reign of Edward. Westminster is different from Kingston in terms of local administration, as it was not a meeting place for the local 100, not as far as we can see anyway. And the coronations are a little bit difficult to reconstruct, but clearly by 1066 and maybe a little bit earlier too. And there are other written accounts as well that refer to coronations having taken place in London, but it's difficult to know exactly what is meant by that. where we can trace the importance of Westminster in this area again far back in time, both through written and archaeological evidence. Westminster Abbey then is founded in the second half of the 10th century, and then it was refounded and rebuilt by Edward the Confessor, and rebuilt in a much grander style than before, Romanesque church, but little remains of this today. There's also archaeological excavation that suggests has been the existence of an earlier church underneath the abbey. I would say that the archaeological evidence is quite sparse, but it has been used to suggest that there was a minster church in place here in the late 8th or the 9th century. And then we've got the palace, and there's quite a lot of interesting information has appeared about the palace in the last few years. So it suggested that King Edward built a palace here then at the same time as his 11th century refoundation of Westminster Abbey. And by this time then, Westminster Abbey had equaled or even outstripped Winchester in importance. And we can, this is really linked to Edward's desire to rule from towns rather than from sort of rural areas. And this kind of links into what I said earlier about the Scandinavian shift from rural assembly sites and more focusing on towns. So in Edward's reign, we can see this increasing shift, and all his major assemblies were held at Westminster. But also then Edward's predecessor Knut has been connected to Westminster. There are a number of written references that can be seen as connection to Westminster, and there's been excavation here and has found evidence of a possible royal manor or a palace, and that this is then earlier than the assumed construction of a palace by Edward. There's a potential bridge which aligns with the later palace entrance, and the radiocarbon dates from some of the construction wooden posts date from so between 970 or 1050, depending on the calibration. So it's been suggested then that the bridge may date from the early years of King Edward, or possibly also an earlier king here then, and maybe Knut or perhaps even King Edgar around the time of St. Dunstan's foundation, started constructing a palace here. So it's a little bit vague. But there are some interesting indications. Then we also got assembly features. Just go through them quite a bit quickly here. We've got land routes converging here. So the Roman Watling Street seems to have been a medieval fording place here as well. Again, we have an island location. It's on the floodplain, had a raised profile. It was visible from afar, and it's also a boundary location. In the Anglo-Saxon period then, this area of Westminster was known as Thorn Island, now preserved in Thorney Island. Thorney Street is still found there today. And the topographical study and excavation have shown then that Thorney Island was the small islet that you can see reconstructed here on this map, where the Thames met the River Tyburn. So this area then of the Thames was subject to regular flooding, or irregular as well. It is this uncontrollable part of the foreshore. So again, it has this really interesting position in the landscape, and there are a number of Anglo-Saxon assembly sites that contain tree names, and especially thorn names. So this in itself then really is suggested of an assembly site. So let's go to Runnymede and look at that. So of course it's a well-known site, and in the words of Magna Carta itself, the document, it says, it was given by our hand in the meadow that is called Runnymede between Windsor and Thames. And of course, one reason why Magna Carta was sealed in Runnymede was that this was when sort of the meeting between King John and the Barrows, that so Runnymede was really in sort of no man's land between the king and the barons. The barons had taken London, had their front line at Staines, and with Staines Bridge on the Thames around 2 kilometres from Runnymede. And John, on the other hand, he was based then at Windsor Castle, about 7 kilometres northwest of Runnymede. And there's been some interesting work recently by Tim Tatton Brown, and he made a really interesting map study, for example, and he made this very important observation that the current place of the National Trust site of Runnymede, it cannot be the old location of Runnymede. And he showed the map from 1725, where the area that's called Runnymede today consists of 2 meadows, Runnymede in the east and Longmead in the west. So it's useful because then we can study the features of the actual Runnymede in greater detail. And what can we see? So Runnymede also has some really important assembly traits. The name goes back to Middle English name, meaning sort of taking counsel and meadow. So that in itself is really important. Also, Runnymede has these very long-standing royal connections. It was situated on the edge of Windsor Forest, which was a royal hunting ground, and Old Windsor Royal Estate and Hunting Lodge for Edward the Confessor was situated a few kilometres east of Runnymede. Old Windsor was also an important estate for crown wearing rituals during Easter, Whitsun, for example, between 1070 and 1107. This tradition was in decline in the 12th century, and then in the 12th century, Henry I moved his residence to Windsor Castle then, and Old Windsor was abandoned. But looking at the name again, then it does seem that it was an assembly site. That the name suggests it's an assembly site, but there are no assemblies recorded. There's an interesting reference to a Whitton held at Old Windsor in 1065, could possibly be a reference to Runnymede. Also looking at the site features, we've got land and water routes converging here. And in the northern part, there was an old road, most likely a raised causeway, which connected Old Windsor to Staines Bridge, and then all into the sort of bigger road system in the Middle Ages. So it's really good for in communication purposes. It's also then situated on the intersection of a number of boundaries. This was the meeting point of 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, 300s, and 4 dioceses. So in that sense, Runnymede would have been ideally placed for meetings involving people from different districts or dioceses, or indeed kingdoms. And a boundary location is quite likely for that, this is assembly that served high up in the assembly hierarchy. Another feature then is that Runnymede was located on a small island. This one was about 3 kilometers long. The island had a Thames to the north, and another natural river channel is now called Langham Pond to the south. So in that sense, it was in a liminal position, and this was enhanced then because its location was on the Thames floodplain. It seems that Langham Pond may have silted up by 1215. And I don't think that really made a big difference in terms of its, being a sort of symbolic island location. At least, again, if you're looking at Scandinavian parallels, it's quite common that they're surrounded by watercourses or wetland. It doesn't have, there seems to be open water. Wetland seems to have been quite sufficient to count as sort of a boundary zone around the assembly. Also looking at this site from an assembly site perspective, John Baker and Stuart Brooks, who of course studied assembly sites in this area, have said that Runnymede fits into the hanging promontory site, which is a type of assembly sites. They say have mound-like features and are often accessible only from a clearly defined approach. So I think we can see that Runnymede fit into this same pattern too. So we really see that all these sites, they share a number of characteristics: location on key communication routes, and they have, location on convergence of land and water routes. They're all natural meeting places. There are island locations as well, meaning that the assemblies were then clearly delimited from the surrounding area. They're also easy to control. And they all seem to have, at least Kingston and Westminster clearly have, long biographies. The sites that seem to be used from the Mesolithic, Neolithic onwards, and this may have been the case with Runnymede too. But as the Thames Valley then became increasingly important for the administration of the kingdom, these sites were elaborated or taken over by kings and used as places for important rituals and meetings. There are some differences between these sites too. They all have strong royal connections, of course. One of the most striking differences is the presence or lack of buildings. So the Royal Vale of Kingston on Thames is not found archaeologically, but it most likely consisted of a wooden hall with associated buildings. Westminster developed into a major palace and a monastic site. Both Kingston and Westminster are seen to have had early Anglo-Saxon minster churches, but there's no indication that a royal estate existed at Runnymede, but we do have Old Windsor then located a few kilometres away. Another important theme is breaks and continuity of use, something that I also touched upon in the Scandinavian assembly sites. And the site that remained in use the longest is, of course, Westminster, the current site of Parliament. And their long-term use of this site is clearly linked to then Edward the Confessor's conscious decision to develop Westminster so that he could hold assemblies in towns. But it's important then that this decision was taken on the basis of an assembly tradition, and most likely then established through the activities of kings using this site, and it gradually becoming really important as sort of legitimizing royals. So before I finish, I just wanted to show you another Scandinavian parallel, and that is Stockholm, capital of Sweden, of course, and because we have a very, very similar pattern here. Stockholm, in terms of being a capital, is actually a really late development. It doesn't really start appearing as the capital until the 17th century. So before that, there's Uppsala, and there's also itinerant kingship, like we see in England in the early Middle Ages. But Stockholm seems to have really started on this very, very small island. This is located in Lake Mälaren, which connected to the Baltic, and it's a really major lake that leads far into the medieval kingdom. This island is now in Stockholm's old town, and the people who have studied this, there's been a lot of archaeological excavation and investigation around this area lately, and it's shown that this is, first of all, in a key strategic location. The purple here you can see is a ridge, so being sort of a route from prehistoric times. This island is interpreted as a sacred island and a meeting point for ships and people involved in military operations, connected to religious rituals, trade, and assemblies. It's also located on the boundary. This here is the black is the modern boundary here, but between two districts and 2 counties today. But when we go further back in time, this area is actually contested, and both districts laid claim to this particular island. So this is the old town. This is where the royal palace is located, and presumably the earliest sort of parliaments as well. And these days, the modern parliament is located just on the next island away from here. So we have a similar kind of concentration of features. So just to wrap up then, and going back to England and the sites we've been talking about, Kingston and Thames, of course, developed differently from Westminster. It faded in importance from the 11th century. But again, this is probably part of the king's desire to move away from rural sites, absence of a monastery, as religious sites really seem to take over at this point in time, and they became very important in royal assemblies and events. But, you know, Kingston hasn't completely lost its importance. It's a royal borough, an administrative centre for Surrey. In terms of Runnymede, this site too seemingly fell out of use. We have no further assemblies recorded here. But we do have an interesting shift here. That's, you know, and this is, of course, the shift from Old Windsor, Runnymede, to Windsor Castle from the 12th century onwards. And we've got assemblies documented here from the 12th century. So just in conclusion then, I think in view of the evidence I presented here, I hope I've tried to convince you that perhaps it's not so surprising that these 3 sites in particular then have, you know, chosen for such important roles in the history of the English kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. So just busy pressing my little clapping reaction button there. That was fabulous. I mean, I'm so excited to got you along to talk, because I mean, it's not often we have a published paper by an eminent scholar that deals so much with things to do with historic medieval Surrey. So, you know, 2 sites within the historic county boundary, another one, you know, within sight of it. So absolutely brilliant. People want to put stuff in the chat. I'm going to do that annoying thing of using the chair's privilege to ask the first question, which is, I don't know, it's probably quite a niche one, but I'm just interested by the lack of material cultural activity or signature for activity taking place at assemblies. And I just wondered if, Alex, can you just sort of either speculate or give us some maybe fruits of research as to why that is? That sort of just, you know, people don't drop that much stuff over the course of a matter of days in one place. Or is that something more deliberate around people just not bringing items to assemblies?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question, and it's something that, of course, thought a lot about, because when we started, especially with Sarah Temple and I really started thinking about, you know, the archaeological signature of assembly sites, and we were really interested to see then if, you know, if you could excavate and say, right, this is an assembly site, you know, you will find X, Y, Z features. And that is not the case at all. It seems to be, it's more, I think that what the activities that took place don't seem to have left so many traces. But I'm also thinking that it's so difficult, of course, because there are, you know, there might have been burials, there are maybe standing stones, there are wooden posts, sometimes ship settings. And they're all part of the assemblies, but they can also have other functions too. So then it's so difficult to say what is part of the assembly and what isn't part of the assembly. So that's the first dilemma that we're always facing. Then I think that they don't seem to have, I think they probably did business, and sometimes there is trade at certain assembly sites that are sort of markets that have been found nearby, but that's relatively rare. And it seems to be particular sites. I think they probably did lots of deals, but I think they didn't bring so much stuff, as you say. They might brought the little bits and pieces, but more perhaps, you know, I will come and you know, collect the hay from you, but you didn't bring, of course, bring the hay to the assembly. So I think it's much more of that. And then sometimes there's camping, you know, Iceland, for example, you've got the booths that they erected. But it's all, that's kind of the most striking evidence that there is. So on the whole, I think the most tangible seems to be cooking and sometimes camping. But the rituals themselves don't seem to have left so many traces.
Very wholesome. I think this is a question from Elvin. Thank you very much for your talk. Can we take later the descriptions of Alpine as perhaps being similar to meetings in England or Iceland 500 years beforehand?
Yes, another good question. Well, to some extent, I think, yes, of course, it's not going to be identical. But I think, first of all, I think we're dealing with quite long-standing traditions, quite conservative societies. And I also think that there is only so many ways you can, you know, have an outdoors assembly, you know, so there will be certain similarities. And one reason I'm saying this is because, I mean, I was, you know, reading the really famous chapter in Tacitus, you know, when he describes the Germanic assembly. And I know that many people are really not fans of Tacitus and say, oh, he's made it all up, it's all based on Rome and all these things. But if you look at that description and then you compare to what you know about Scandinavian assemblies, for example, what you're looking at the laws, there are some absolute fantastic parallels in there. So I think that, of course, we can't just translate it, but I think especially ideas about, you know, meeting outdoors with an audience and, you know, performing this to an audience outdoors, I think that is something that is absolutely that a feature of both, you know, England and Iceland, for example.
Great. Anyone wants to put any more questions in the chat? Do so. I think we'll take maybe one more. We'll move on. I'll ask a quick filler one now. Just look at, I mean, considering both actually your Swedish example and the ones you've shown us here in England. Have you noticed any kind of patterns as to why some towns are sort of co-located with these assembly sites and others aren't? And, you know, obviously, both Westminster and Kingston sort of superimposed upon the earlier sites, whereas, as you instance, Lincoln being a sort of somewhat distant, and Runnymede and Windsor are very much separate, or at least you know, separated by physical distance. There's a sort of patterning around that that seems to hold true.
Yeah, that is quite, yeah, I have to say Runnymede is a little bit tricky why that was not interesting anymore. Obviously there's no important buildings, no monasteries or anything were erected there, and whether that was sufficient to make it not so interesting anymore. And then Windsor just taking over, but in a very different way, perhaps. Because I think Windsor is the key there, that it didn't lose that completely, because we've got that very important site. But I tend also to think, and that's a good question, because I haven't really thought in detail about it, but it also tends to be practicalities, you know, that the sites that are the most convenient to use. And that, I don't know whether somebody else has thought about that, whether London was particularly convenient at that point in time as well, so that because for me it seems to be a lot of the time there are conscious choices made, and they are a lot of them linked to the past, but there's also practical considerations that come into play. So whether that was something that made London also really useful at that point in time. But that's a good question. I need to think more about that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, Alex. That was but let's move on to our second gentleman. So we both come from the Runnymede Explored project, which is a joint endeavour between the National Trust and the Surrey County Archaeological Unit, a funded project over 5 years, I read, which we're into sort of, it's still in the early stages, I believe. So James Brown is the National Trust archaeologist for London and the South East region. I know if anyone follows him on social media, has ever met him, then he's a man who travels far and wide in the name of archaeology in this region. Gets to see some very nice things as a result. See, you know, tonight is speaking to us on Runnymede, so we're very grateful he's narrowed his focus to northwest Surrey for us. And with him is Harry Farmer, who has one of the longer job titles in the archaeological sector: Historic Environment Advice Assistant Apprentice for London and the South East region. I met Harry last week. I think he's been in the job 5 or so months, a much longer placement. Again, working on Runnymede Explored, but also many other things. And I hope to be working with Harry in the HER in due course. I will stop talking at this point and so over to you, gentlemen.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for inviting me along, and also thanks to Alex for a fascinating talk. There's a bit of a roller coaster of emotions as going up and down of panicking. We'd made some bad decisions in some of the projects we're about to start talking about, but then kind of reassuring in other ways. So, but yeah, as Rob's introduced, I'm kind of James Brown. I work as one of the regional archaeologists for the National Trust in London South East, and I have the kind of pleasure of trying to keep an eye on the National Trust holding in archaeology across Hampshire, Sussex and Surrey. So a bit of a widespread, and as much as I'd love to spend all my time more focused on sites, I kind of unfortunately have the bit where I've got to kind of go and kind of respond to phone calls or react to various kind of challenges that come in, so I don't get to focus my attention. However, one of the things that I've kind of, since I started, been lucky to pick up is the Runnymede Explored project. This is a project that was put together before I started, and has been a bit of a stop-start, but is finally getting to the kind of phases where actually there's going to be some interesting archaeological activity over the next couple of years. So it's a really good time to come and talk to you about what we're going to be doing at kind of the Runnymede site. It's a kind of National Lottery Heritage Funded project, and the idea is to use kind of along many themes. One of them is to look at archaeology and use archaeology as a way of engaging kind of local communities in the local landscape, and kind of engaging with kind of stains and those kind of areas, and kind of bring people in using archaeology. And as part of that, we've been able to use the Heritage Lottery Fund money to kind of employ Surrey County Archaeology Unit to work kind of focus on the project, and also, as Rob's alluded to, actually bring in an apprentice onto the project as well. So we are really lucky in this area that we have kind of Surrey County Archaeology Unit and kind of Harry's time kind of focused on doing work at Runnymede. So it's kind of your kind of quite blessed in the fact you've actually got some kind of National Trust archaeological focus. And the idea of the Runnymede Explored project, as well as kind of engaging people with that kind of the archaeology, is to try and unite the two sites of Runnymede and Anclewick. I actually should probably start showing my screen. It might make it a lot more easier when I'm having a slide in the background. Let's see if the magic sharing is going to work. Hopefully everyone now can see a presentation. I will assume that I haven't heard anything, that no one's panicking, that nothing's appeared. So yeah, it's kind of the idea. I shall go on to the next slide because it will actually show you. I assume I'm talking to obviously an audience here that know the area really well. Let's turn this on to PowerPoint, but to the laser pointer, hopefully we'll be able to see that. But we're looking at the site of Runnymede here, which is kind of managed by the National Trust, and then Anclewick with the nunnery north of the river, and looking at these two sites and whether we can unite these sites and kind of enrich the visitor journey at the sites. So realize we just kind of sat through a talk, so I'm going to try and minimize the amount of speaking I do, but I just wanted to take an opportunity to talk about what we're going to be doing at these sites over the next year. And I could probably fill up a whole time talking about them, but actually just almost use a bit of a teaser with the idea that hopefully maybe later in the year we might be able to get you on as a group onto the site for a bit of a kind of walking tour and explore, or potentially come back later in the year to discuss what we've been up to in a bit more detail. Looking at these two sites in terms of archaeology, we've kind of tried to set ourselves two research questions, one at kind of Runnymede side and one at the Anclewick side. The one at the Runnymede site, I'm now kind of slightly panicking about, because the idea was to use whether we could use archaeological techniques to try and narrow down the discussion about where Magna Carta might have been signed or assembly sites. And obviously with Alex saying that we're potentially now trying to find an assembly site where there might not be a huge amount of archaeological evidence, that might be a bit of a challenge, but it's one we're kind of willing to take on. And I think it'll be kind of, after listening to that talk for an hour, I've kind of come away with a few ideas, and I'd like to kind of see how we can potentially test them and use volunteers to engage in that activity over the next year. And the kind of research question on the Anclewick side is around the conversion of the nunnery into a Tudor mansion, and then that kind of changing the design landscape on the north side. But I will talk more now about the Runnymede side. And I'm just going to move my floating face out of the way because it's slightly, sorry, I'm just moving that around. So yeah, so we're going to try it on the focus on the Runnymede side. This is the 1912 map, where obviously it's got on here Runnymede, and it tells us on the OS map where it was the Magna Carta was signed. So can we use archaeological processes to train volunteers and kind of engage local community in potentially trying to answer the question of, can we actually find any evidence of the signing of Magna Carta? And an area that we have particularly kind of got ourselves interested in is this kind of field marks on the 1912 map here. It's referred to by the farmer as the Arable Field, because at some point it's been ploughed up. But I'm going to show you a few slides now, a bit more of why we've kind of started to focus our attention on this side. And actually with the talk that Alex has done, talking around the River Thames, the north, and Langham Ponds, which you can see labelled on the river on the map here, shows we might be sort of in the right place to start looking, but whether we'll find anything, well, that's what we'll kind of got to find out. So next slide. Oh, I've just put some, because it's bits of a presentation I've used for other people, so I thought I'd put some photos of the 1934 Runnymede pageant and the recreation of the signing of Magna Carta, and potentially how it might have looked like with an audience in attendance, but we'll skip over that kind of slightly quickly. I thought it was also worth mentioning about Magna Carta Island. This is one of the bits that's been discussed as a possible location, and I think I believe there's a monument built on the island, private ownership. I believe there's a monument built on there claiming that Magna Carta was signed on Magna Carta Island, but we'll move on from that to focus actually on our Runnymede side. So as I said, our kind of area that we are starting to focus our attentions on is this field I referred to as the Arable Fields. You can find this kind of slightly interesting shape in the middle of the map, and this plan, the 1824 kind of Egham racecourse plan, kind of the course around respects that field in the middle. And this kind of the field, or this area, this kind of area of enclosure has been kind of pretty much on all the maps that we can find for the area. And Stuart Burgess, who was the ex-National Trust warden, has been doing some historical research and has found in the National Archives a reference to this field potentially being created or enclosed around 1500, but it's from a document, but I can send some more details through them after. That's information that's come through to me this morning, so I don't have all the information on that. But with reference to Alex's talk about kind of this idea of islands, the liminal space, the next slide is a 1936 aerial photograph that's I assume most people now have found the new Historic England historic aerial photography viewer, a kind of a bit of an update of Britain from above, but there's a huge amount of various aerial photographs, well worth a look if you haven't had a look yet, though bit of a warning, you could end up losing a lot of your time on there. But this is one of the photos showing Runnymede in 1936, the flooded water, and that area of land that we're interested in kind of really sits out as a bit of an island here. And this is the kind of around the back here is this area of Langham Ponds referred to earlier as well. And again, if we look at the flood mapping information available to us, so actually this is a 2014 Google Earth image. The area that we're kind of focusing on is this area in here, and you can see that kind of waterlogged site around to the north, and Langham Ponds kind of around to the south here, and the current line of the River Thames kind of coming through up here. And I think, yeah, actually on the again the flood mapping, or the kind of flood risk mapping, you can see quite clearly that this idea of various kind of channels, and looking at again the maps that Alex showed earlier for different sites, this kind of almost really starts kind of building a bit of a picture that this could be a site to investigate a bit further. So how we're going to go about it is that we've commissioned Quest, I believe are based out of Reading University, to do some geoarchaeological work. So they're going to be taking some samples across the whole site to look at the kind of the silting, the various channels that are there. And we are currently working with Andrew Hutt, Berkshire Archaeological Society, and actually some of the Surrey Archaeological Society volunteers, undertaking a geophysical survey of this area now. And I think Harry has been out there today and has sent me through some of the preliminary results. So I'll try, it's not on the PowerPoint, but I'll try and show that in a minute when I close the kind of the slides down, because there's some work going on there. So yeah, and I think, oh yeah, a bit of a text-heavy slide, apologies, but just saying, yeah, we're going to be looking at the geoarchaeological work, investigations around Langham Ponds and across that arable field towards the River Thames, and we're currently undertaking that geophysical survey with the idea that if we get kind of results from that, alongside the geophysical survey, we're also undertaking a metal detecting survey. The site at Runnymede has in the past been subject to illicit metal detecting. So we're, as part of our works on the site, we're going to be taking a systematic metal detecting survey alongside the geophysical survey, which will allow us to eventually try and understand the site a bit more, but also look at how we are talking in the kind of to the local population, say, well, actually, we've done the metal detecting survey, so hopefully that might distract people from coming in and get an idea they want to do it themselves. And depending on those results, we are going to be talking with the tenant farmer, because this is an area that has got cows grazing on it, about potential excavation. But I don't want to get too carried away yet. But with the results coming through, hopefully we'll be able to have a bit more information to that out to yourselves in the not too distant future. And obviously, talking about it today, the idea is that this is the kind of activity that's happening on the site, and we want kind of to get yourselves involved with that as well. Right, what time are we on? We're 15 minutes or so. Might just kind of just wanted to talk very quickly about the Anclewick side. I know I wouldn't say that's of less interest to you being across the river, but I think talking about these idea of assembly sites linked to monasteries, and actually how rivers have been the River Thames specifically been very important sites, and not they don't really or shouldn't be considered as boundaries. They're more kind of communication networks. So I think it is worth considering or talking a little bit about the site of Anclewick across the river, and the nunnery that was there, that was found in 1160, dissolved in 1536. This is a seal from the National Archives that gives us idea of it kind of being a wooden thatched church at the nunnery. As I say, the nunnery dissolved in 1536 and went through a bit of a period of being handed around. So it didn't nothing really happened too quickly on the site until about 1550, when Sir Thomas Smith took control of the site and built his kind of mansion on the site, which was then kind of later moved. I've got the site here, so it was slightly later developed in kind of post 1800, when it moved into a bit of the house and the focus of the site moved to the north. This is the pretty much the best evidence we have for the kind of Tudor conversion of the nunnery at Anclewick. This is the 1800 Rosebery Enclosure Map, and it gives this idea of a kind of plan of the building with two projecting wings, and these are later kind of 18th century pictorial representations, which seem to sort of match to that. We've got this idea of the two wings coming out here, and actually this is a souvenir handkerchief that one of our curators found in the V&A collection. It's not the best on the slide here, but we've got this idea of the kind of the similar kind of plan to the house here, but then there is this interesting sort of change in building on the side here, which we'd like to investigate further. So again, this is a site. This is a site that we have been. It's a scheduled monument site, so we have a lot more kind of hoops we've got to jump through on that site. But we have been undertaking quite a lot of geophysics to try and understand that kind of changing of the phasing of the landscape on that side. This is geophysics that was done in 2006, 2008. The photo I had at the slide at the very beginning had the kind of the L-shaped upstanding remains, which is all that's pretty much visible of any kind of building structure on the Anclewick side. That's this little white L shape here. And the Anclewick U, which is another site of interest and to various audiences, is this green spot up here. The geophysics shows up this kind of formal garden layout to the kind of the south of the kind of existing structure. It was referred to on the HER, I think, as a building platform, but that's kind of Berkshire HER, so Rob doesn't have to worry about that. But we kind of seen in the geophysics, we're looking at this kind of formal garden layout, potentially with some kind of feature in the middle of the cross paths here. And then the geophysics gets interesting with these various linear building shapes and stuff going up on here. And what we'd like to do, I think I'll kind of move on the slides. I think there's a few more bits of geophysics. I won't talk through this, and it's a lot more easier to probably explain this out on site as we walk around. But the area that we're interested in is the area to the north, where potentially we might be looking at some of the cloister arrangement of the nunnery, and potentially I'm going to try and chase it. Hopefully people can see my laser pointer on the screen. Are we looking at the church above there, kind of thing? And this is wider work on the geophysics on the fields and around the scheduled site. As with the Runnymede side, I think what's most important on the Anclewick side is actually trying to understand how the water has been managed, or how the water's moved around the site. And with a lot of I think both of these sites, if we can start to understand how kind of water has been controlled, managed, or just naturally worked around the site, then actually a lot of the wider understanding of the site and how it's been adapted by human hand and shaped in terms of design landscapes or just kind of farmed landscapes will hopefully start to crystallize a bit more. The next couple of slides were just so the research question with the Anclewick side is actually, where was the actual cloister? We've got various historic records and kind of bits of information that have been coming to us, but we don't really have an understanding of the nunnery before it got converted into a Tudor house. I live in Southampton, and I have things like I have Netley Abbey, Titchfield, Mottersfont kind of around me, and they're all different examples that have the cloister either to the north or the south. So there is no kind of common approach, and most of the time it's actually dictated by, again, the landscape it's built in. So my earlier point, if we actually can understand how water has been controlled or moved around the site, that might help us to actually identify which side the cloister and then the rest of the kind of the nunnery setup was. And I'm going to just skip through those. There is a reference here to the work that Surrey County Archaeology did at Reigate, and this one is quite useful to put in. I know Harry's been working on looking at this in a bit more detail, but how you convert your monastic sites into your Tudor mansion, whether you're kind of making use of the church and nave to make your grand hall, or actually are you using kind of areas of the refectory and your projecting wings make use of the cloister site. So if we were looking at the Anclewick with the projecting wings, that might suggest that actually the cloister is underneath the what's now showing up in geophysics as the garden, or is it actually the north? So what we are currently in conversations with Historic England is scheduled monument consent to actually try to answer this question with a couple of trenches. So this is work that just a quick map that Surrey County Archaeology put together with this idea of actually, our cloister is the north or the south. So we are proposing 2 trench locations. We are hoping that this will take place in July this year. I say it's waiting on scheduled monument consent at the moment, but we've had quite a bit of back and forth with Historic England, and at the moment that's going quite positively. I don't want to kind of count my chickens or count my eggs or touch wood, touch head, all those bits and pieces, but hopefully, again, as soon as we hear back from that, we'll kind of be kind of keen to come back and let yourselves know and see if there might be some opportunities to kind of interest some of your members in joining us. So I think then the next slide is just where those trenches are in terms of the geophysics on the site. So it's not the highest resolution on this side here, but if we look at the geophysics in a bit more detail, there is actually a faint building outline actually slightly offset at a different angle underneath this the formal garden as well. So there's a bit more we want to investigate there, but if we can put a trench across this garden here, that I might actually also show any previous landscaping associated with the cloister, and then I still favour this idea of the cloister north, but if we can actually kind of bottom that out with a trench that goes across one of the areas that doesn't have trees growing all over it, I think that could be some really some interesting excavations going ahead there. And tied to that, just again, wider activity, we are going to be doing a whole load of work on improving the condition of the upstanding remains that are on site at the moment. They are mainly chalk survivals, so been subject to quite a bit of weathering. So we are working again with Historic England on a detailed kind of conservation plan, and we're potentially looking in September, October time, undertaking quite potentially a bit of repointing, stabilizing, soft capping, and again, that's something we'll be doing with volunteers. So that was I'm going to stop sharing now. A bit of trying to keep it as brief as possible. Quick kind of jump through what we're going to be doing kind of Runnymede and Anclewick over the next year. and say hopefully we'll be in a position we can come back and give you some various updates or engage you or kind of bring you into being a bit more involved on the site. One of the things I did actually say I was going to do, so I might just try and do that now. Oh, it's still showing anyway. But so hopefully now you're probably all seeing a Word document. I see I'm a bit out of practice now on doing virtual talks. But if you're seeing a Word document with a bit more geophysics, this is that arable field we talked about. So we jump back to the Runnymede side. This is some of the early results coming out from the geophysics that are going on that site at the moment. From kind of historic aerial photographs, we do know there was some anti-glider ditching on the site, which might be explaining some of our kind of very straight linears, but we are also starting to get a lot more activity coming out of that. So potentially something to reassuring that there might be worth going and investigating a bit further, whether that is an assembly site or kind of camps or horse paddocks or anything to do with Magna Carta, we don't know, but that's maybe something we can try and give an answer to, or maybe get Alex involved coming down and actually seeing if we can excavate a site and link anything to some of the research she's been doing on assembly sites. That I'll leave that as the baited hook, and see if there's any questions, and I will stop sharing now so we can all see each other again. And yeah, thank you very much. So there's a lot more to talk about. I've realized I've kind of skipped over the top of quite a lot of detail, but didn't want to kind of again talk to you for, well, I suppose actually you're probably all interested individuals, so you're probably quite happy to listen to me chat away, but we'll save that for another time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. That's very tantalising, and it's certainly something I want to see how it develops over the coming months. And what interests me, just a kind of very quick point. Oh, Alex, yes, please.
Oh, you can go ahead. I don't need to go now.
No. You're going to say something far more.
No. Oh, I'll go on since I've no. That was exciting. That's great. Really, really interesting. I'm actually so pleased that you're doing that work. And yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to sound that negative. That there's no point. Because what you're doing is exactly kind of the work that we have been doing, and I've got a very, very similar project starting in the summer with the Mora, the Swedish inauguration site, which is, I think, worse than Runnymede now because it's a massive ploughed field. But with exactly that kind of work that you've been doing now, just looking at the water levels and reconstructing the island, and you just pinpointing the area of the focus area, and that's actually really where you want to be, isn't it? And I was just thinking, exactly, metal detecting geophysics, absolutely, the way to go. And the race course is interesting because, I mean, I don't know if you've noticed that, but there's a link with modern race coursing in assembly sites. And there is sometimes in the sources you find that they refer to lots of competitions, and there seems to have been either horse fighting or horse racing at the assembly sites as well. And there's a site in Sweden, Öland, where they've located this massive race course recently. So that, I don't know, but that's quite interesting. That, and I was also thinking about, crossing points might be something. I mean, because you do trying to find that, and then and the geoarchaeology. Could you tell a little bit more what you're looking for there? Are you trying to reconstruct water levels or activity, or what are you aiming for? Sorry, there's a lot there, but it's just really exciting.
It's okay. The race course one, I hadn't really kind of actually thought about it that much. It's one that I've kind of been interested in, but actually, because it always seemed, again, how it worked with the kind of the various kind of enclosure maps and whatever activity was going on the site, but actually linking it into that idea of gathering and almost that kind of progression from people gathering on horse, and then there's bits of competition, bits of games and challenges, and that. So yeah, that's one I need to go back and maybe kind of draw out a bit more in our desk-based assessment, and again link into that. In terms of geoarchaeology, the focus is on I think there's a lot of references to Langham Ponds potentially being the old kind of meander or kind of channel. So can we actually, again, for that, use a process to really kind of confirm that? And then seeing actually how, I think the other side for us is that interested about how much silting activity has been going on, and if we're taking these cores, actually is there opportunity to do some environmental work on them as well. So it's one of those, we're in a lucky position. National Trust, we've got access to the land, we own it, so we can do these kind of projects, and we've got the HLF funding, so we have got those opportunities to kind of really kind of try and throw everything at it within reason, or at least kind of link up with kind of partners to do that. So yeah, the main thrust is looking at those, trying to identify those old kind of channels, and get an idea of potentially how they've kind of how that water levels change kind of thing across the site. The other one is obviously with that kind of build up of the arable one, we've showed in that 1936 aerial that there's definite, and we walk across the site, there's a definite step up. It's not even a really subtle one anymore, but actually is that result of kind of ploughing and people adding to it, or is it more of that kind of historic process that has focused on island? So it'd be interesting to see what's happening under that kind of just bit of what's now a grazed field, in terms of layering of sediment and different kind of different sediments kind of thing. I'll stop at that point. Got myself into a hole there.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks. And I don't know, because I haven't studied the place names in great detail, but sometimes, especially the horse racing and the activities, find traces in place names. So that might be worth just seeing if there's anything there. But thank you, really interesting.
The point I was going to make a very brief one, just interesting actually, both papers touching on Runnymede talked about map evidence and the both the advantages and potential pitfalls of being drawn by. What I'm interested in, the one you showed, James, and that the fact it had not one but two Magna Carta related labels, one Magna Carta Island claiming the big prize, and the other one having to kind of settle for second best of being where everyone camped. And I just wondered kind of what have you kind of looked into the basis of that, and whether just Mr. Magna Carta Island had sort of persuaded the OS surveyor or field investigator of the superior credentials of that, or
oh yeah, I haven't actually in detail. Stuart Burgess, I made a reference as our kind of ex-warden, I think has done a lot with the kind of chat with the local population about the various stories and bits and pieces. And I think it was one that he was always quite keen that the National Trust tried to acquire the island, because I think he was this idea that it might have been split across several sites. But yeah, I kind of used to so many maps of these various bits labelled on there, and you can almost imagine, I've heard various podcasts with people, the surveyors for the Ordnance Survey, who were out and potentially convinced or encouraged to put a label on or kind of get a bit creative at some points, kind of thing. It's difficult. I think it'd be interesting maybe to look into a bit the Ordnance Survey archives to see almost things like, actually they're in the National Archives, things like the Minuteman books and those kind of boundary, so kind of get an idea where these labels came from. And I suppose the other one would be to see, have you got things like the record cards, the Ordnance Survey record cards in the HER?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, so it might be interesting to have a look at if there's the Ordnance Survey record cards, because there might be some link there. But yeah, no, actually that's one I'd be quite keen to. I always love maps kind of thing, so any opportunity to delve more into maps, a question to address. So yeah, we'll add that to your list, Harry, shall we?
Yeah, certainly. My understanding is that it is a later place name attributed by private ownership, the name Magna Carta Island, but that's my limited understanding so far.
Adds a bit to the house price.
Yeah, certainly.
Any further questions from anyone?